The Zetheriai considered themselves masters of the cosmos. Their crystalline vessels drifted through space like ethereal jellyfish, each one a testament to millions of years of evolutionary and technological superiority. They had studied thousands of species across hundreds of galaxies, categorizing, analyzing, and often determining the fate of entire civilizations. Their latest subject of interest, Earth. High Commander Vexthor stood before the massive observation window of the research vessel Eternal Seeker, their iridescent carapace reflecting the pale blue light of the planet below. 3 pairs of compound eyes processed different spectrum analyses simultaneously as they watched their latest acquisition target. Subject identified, announced lead researcher NYR, their voice a melodious combination of clicks and whispers. Isolated human specimen, displaying unusual repetitive movements in a remote mountain location. Preliminary scans indicate minimal technological augmentation, perfect for our baseline studies. The target was Rei Tanaka, though the aliens watching her knew nothing of names or the significance of what they were witnessing. At 19, she had already earned recognition as one of Japan's most promising young kendo practitioners. But today, she wasn't practicing kendo. In the pre-dawn light atop Mount Asahi, Rei moved through the ancient forms of Iajutsu, her grandfather's sword cutting through the morning mist with practiced precision. The Zetheriai observation team made their first mistake in assuming the sword was merely decorative. Their second mistake was dismissing the fluid grace of her movements as simple exercise. Their final and most crucial mistake was believing that youth equated to vulnerability. Commence extraction, Vexthor commanded, their crystalline appendages shifting in anticipation. Standard containment protocols will suffice. The abduction beam engaged with characteristic efficiency, a column of pale green light descending from the cloaked ship. Rei's first indication that something was wrong came not from sight or sound, but from the sudden shift in air pressure. Years of training had honed her awareness far beyond normal human limits. She felt the change in the atmosphere, the static charge building around her. As the beam enveloped her, Rei didn't panic. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, the mind that remains calm in chaos is already victorious. The sword, a family heirloom that had survived centuries including the fires of World War II, remained firmly in her grip as she was lifted from the Earth's surface. The Zetheriai containment chamber was designed to hold creatures far larger and presumably more dangerous than a human teenager. Its energy fields could restrain beings capable of lifting several times their own weight. Its atmospheric controls could render most species unconscious within seconds. None of its designers had considered the possibility that their technology might be defeated by skills passed down through 40 generations of sword masters. Fascinating, NYR observed, watching as their subject maintained perfect poise even during molecular reconstruction. The specimen shows unusual autonomic control. Note the regulated breathing pattern and maintained grip strength. Irrelevant, dismissed Security Chief Kaz-Th, their blade-like limbs clicking against the metal floor. Begin standard processing. The chamber activated, its white walls humming with power. Rei stood motionless, eyes closed, breathing steady. To the Zetheriai, she appeared to be in shock or possibly praying, another misconception born of countless encounters with species that broke under the stress of first contact. Rei was meditating, yes, but not out of fear or religious devotion. She was mapping the room through sound, feeling the vibrations through her feet, timing the pulses of energy that rippled through the containment field. The sword in her hands was more than a weapon, it was a tuning fork, resonating with the chamber's energy frequency. Commence biological scan, ordered NYR, manipulating controls on a floating console. Standard penetration depth. The first scanning beam struck the containment field at precisely the moment Rei opened her eyes. What followed would be debated in Zetheriai scientific circles for decades to come. The sword moved in a perfect arc, its ancient steel singing at exactly the right frequency to create a cascading disruption in the containment field. Physics professors would later explain it as a chance harmonic resonance. Rei's grandfather would have called it the meeting point of spirit and steel. The field shattered like glass, its energy dispersing in a shower of sparks. Alarms blared throughout the ship as Rey took her first free step in the alien vessel. The Zetheri observers stood frozen, their compound eyes reflecting a sight unprecedented in their species' long history, a contained specimen, not only conscious but free, holding what their scans had dismissed as a primitive cutting tool. Impossible, breathed Kaz-TH, reaching for the emergency protocols panel. The containment field was rated 4-. They never finished the sentence. Rey moved with the speed and precision born of thousands of hours of practice. The sword flashed once, and the panel erupted in a shower of sparks and crystalline shards. The lights in the chamber flickered, then died, plunging the room into emergency red lighting. In the crimson glow, Rei Tanaka stood ready, her grandfather's sword held in a position that had remained unchanged since the Kamakura period. Before her, the Zetheri faced something their species had never encountered in all their studies of the cosmos, a human who was not afraid. The ship's AI began broadcasting warnings in multiple languages, none of which Rey understood. She didn't need to. The universal language of survival transcended species, and she could read the shift in the alien's posture from scientific curiosity to defensive alarm. As security drones began to fill the chamber, Rey allowed herself a small smile. Some part of her, the part that had always found peace in the discipline of the sword, recognized that this was simply another form of practice. The only difference was the stakes. The first drone launched itself at her with mechanical precision. In response, Rey moved with the fluid grace of centuries of martial tradition. The drone fell in 2 pieces, its internal mechanisms sparking uselessly. More followed, and with each strike, each perfect cut, the Zetheri began to understand their grave miscalculation. They had not captured a specimen. They had brought aboard a warrior. The corridors of the Eternal Seeker transformed into a maze of chaos as Rey moved through them with deliberate purpose. Emergency lighting cast everything in a pulsing crimson glow, and the ship's automated warnings echoed in languages from across the galaxy. Behind her, she left a trail of disabled drones and sparking security systems. Unprecedented, First Observer Mira X muttered, watching the security feeds from the ship's command center. Their crystalline form vibrated with a mixture of fear and fascination. The specimen is displaying tactical awareness far beyond anticipated capabilities. High Commander Vexthor's carapace had darkened with stress, a sign of deep disturbance among the Zetheri. Deploy the containment squadrons. All of them. The ship itself seemed to respond to Rey's presence, corridors sealing and rerouting, atmospheric controls attempting to render sections of the vessel uninhabitable. But for each obstacle the ship created, Rey found a solution born from years of training. When passages sealed, she cut through them. When the air thinned, she controlled her breathing just as she had learned to do during mountain training. As she navigated deeper into the vessel, Rey began to notice something that the Zetheri had hoped to keep secret. Behind sealed doors and transparent barriers, other creatures watched her passage. Beings from dozens of worlds, all captured for study, their eyes following her movement with growing hope. A squadron of security drones cornered her in what appeared to be a medical bay. These were larger than the earlier models, armed with energy weapons that hummed with lethal potential. Rey assessed her situation with the calm clarity her grandfather had instilled in her. The room's architecture, the placement of equipment, the movement patterns of the drones, it was all just another form of the practice she had dedicated her life to understanding. Submit for containment, a mechanical voice commanded in surprisingly good Japanese. Resistance will result in termination. Rey's response was not in words. She moved, her sword describing perfect arcs through the air. The first drone fired, its energy blast missing her by millimeters as she rolled under it. Her blade found the joint between its armored plates, and the drone crashed to the floor. 2 more drones fired simultaneously, but Rey was already moving, using a floating medical table as a springboard to launch herself into the air. Time seemed to slow as she spun above the drones, her sword flowing from one strike to the next. When she landed, for more drones lay in pieces around her. The remaining units backed away, their programming encountering a scenario it had never been designed to handle. In the command center, the Zetheri leadership watched in growing horror as their security systems failed one after another. But it wasn't just the humans' combat prowess that disturbed them, it was the methodical nature of her progress through the ship. She wasn't just fighting, she was learning, adapting, understanding their technology and tactics with each encounter. The other specimens are becoming agitated, reported Security Chief Kaz, their limbs clicking nervously against the control panels. The humans' actions are causing a ripple effect throughout the containment levels. They were right. Throughout the ship, the captured beings from other worlds were watching, learning, and beginning to understand something that the Zetheri had never considered: their captors were not invincible. Ray found the ship's specimen database almost by accident, drawn by the soft glow of its holographic displays. The alien text meant nothing to her, but the images told a clear story. Hundreds of species, thousands of individuals, all captured and studied over centuries. Some had been released back to their worlds with altered memories. Others had not been so fortunate. A new alarm began to sound, different from the others. Through the transparent walls of the medical bay, Ray saw something that made her pause. In containment cells throughout the ship, force fields were fluctuating, failing in a cascade of system crashes. The other specimens, inspired by her example, had begun their own rebellions. Multiple containment failures detected, the ship's AI announced, its melodious voice at odds with the gravity of the situation. Specimen uprising in progress. Security protocols insufficient. In the midst of the growing chaos, Ray made a decision. Her grandfather had taught her that the true purpose of martial arts was not simply combat, it was the protection of those who could not protect themselves. Looking at the faces of the other captured beings, she saw past their alien features to recognize something familiar: the desire for freedom. The Zetheri had made a critical error in their studies of humanity. They had assumed that human strength lay in their technology, their numbers, or their physical capabilities. What they failed to understand was that humanity's true power lay in their ability to inspire others to rise above their fears. As alarms blared and systems failed throughout the ship, Ray Tanaka, a 19-year-old martial artist from Earth, became something more than just an escaped specimen. She became a symbol of resistance, a catalyst for change that would reshape the Zetheri's understanding of the species they had so casually dismissed as primitive. The ship's remaining security forces mobilized for a final confrontation, but they were no longer facing a single escaped human. They were about to face a revolution, sparked by one young woman with an ancient sword and an indomitable spirit. The Zetheri ship's pristine order had dissolved into beautiful chaos. Through corridors designed to contain and control now moved a tide of liberation, led by a human wielding a sword that predated spaceflight. But Ray wasn't just fighting anymore, she was leading. A massive being with crystalline scales and 6 eyes lumbered beside her, its native language translated through a stolen communication device. "I am Crix," it rumbled, using its considerable strength to tear through a sealed doorway. "My people, the Nexari, have been imprisoned here for 3 cycles." Ray nodded, her sword held ready as they advanced. Behind them, a growing collection of freed specimens moved with purpose, some floating, others crawling or slithering, but all united in their quest for freedom. She had learned that the Zetheri's arrogance extended far beyond Earth. They had been collecting and studying species across multiple galaxies for millennia. In the ship's command center, High Commander Vexthor faced the first real crisis of their long career. "How," they demanded, their carapace now almost black with stress. "How has this primitive creature undermined centuries of proven containment protocols?" Lead researcher NYR, who had been analyzing the humans' movements, clicked their mandibles thoughtfully. "We made an error in our initial assessment. The human's weapon, it's not just a cutting tool. It's an extension of their consciousness, a physical manifestation of generations of refined combat philosophy. Philosophy won't save them from our elite guards," Security Chief Kaz snarled, dispatching their most advanced combat units to intercept the growing rebellion. The elite guards found their targets in the ship's main specimen processing center. They were magnificent creations, combining the best of Zetherii biology and technology. Each stood 3 meters tall, their crystalline bodies housing weapons that could reduce most beings to their component atoms. Ray studied them with the same calm focus she brought to every challenge. The freed specimens behind her tensed for battle, but she raised her hand for patience. "Watch," she said in Japanese, knowing that while they might not understand her words, they would understand her intent. Every opponent has a pattern. The guards attacked with devastating coordination, their energy weapons filling the air with deadly light. But Ray moved like water, flowing between the beams with an efficiency that seemed to deny physics. Her sword, singing with each strike, found weak points that the guards' designers had never thought to protect. There, she called out to her allies, demonstrating how to target the guards' joint servos. The pattern reveals itself. The freed specimens learned quickly. A floating cloud of gaseous intelligence short-circuited a guard's neural network. A 6-armed creature with remarkable agility used its natural climbing abilities to outmaneuver another. What had started as a single human's escape had evolved into a masterclass in adaptive combat. But the true revolution wasn't happening in the corridors, it was happening in the ship's vast data cores. A species of silicon-based intelligences, freed from their containment units, had infiltrated the vessel's computer systems. They discovered something that shook the foundation of the Zetherei's authority. "Commander," one of the bridge officers called out, their voice trembling. "The specimens, they're accessing the historical archives." Vexthor's compound eyes widened in horror. "Lock down all data systems immediately." But it was too late. The truth was spreading through the ship's communication networks. The Zetherei's claimed superiority was built on carefully curated lies. Species they had dismissed as primitive had often proven too difficult to control. Rather than admit failure, they had simply erased these encounters from their records. Ray learned of this through her new allies as they fought their way toward the ship's core. The Zetherii weren't just scientists, they were curators of a carefully constructed myth of their own supremacy. Each failed experiment, each species that had resisted their studies, had been hidden away in sealed archives. "Your species," Crix explained as they defended against another wave of security drones, "is not the first to challenge them. But you might be the first to succeed." The revelation added new purpose to Ray's movements. Her grandfather had taught her that true strength lay not in dominating others, but in protecting the truth. Each swing of her sword now carried the weight of not just her own freedom, but the dignity of countless species who had been dismissed and forgotten. Deep in the ship's systems, alarms began to sound that had never been activated before. The Zetherei's carefully maintained illusion of control was shattering. Specimens in containment facilities on other vessels began to stir, connected through the vast network that linked the collector ships. "We are approaching a critical threshold," NYR reported, their scientific detachment finally cracking. "The humans' actions are cascading through our entire collection network. The probability of maintaining control is approaching zero." High Commander Vexthor stood before the command center's main display, watching as centuries of assumed superiority crumbled. They had believed themselves to be the galaxy's greatest scholars, its most advanced civilization. But they had never considered that true advancement might lie not in the ability to control other species, but in the wisdom to respect them. Rei Tanaka, still moving through the ship with the grace of her ancient art, had become more than an escaped specimen. She had become a symbol of everything the Zetherii had failed to understand about the species they studied. In their pursuit of knowledge, they had forgotten the most important lesson of all, that true strength often lies in the very things you dismiss as primitive. The command center of the Eternal Seeker had become a fortress, sealed behind layers of energy shields that the Zetherii had always believed impenetrable. But belief, as they were learning, was a poor substitute for truth. "We've located the primary control nexus," whispered Zin, a being of pure energy contained within a crystalline matrix. The former specimen had become one of Ray's most valuable allies, able to sense the ship's power fluctuations. But the approach is heavily guarded. Ray stood in what had once been a specimen processing chamber, now transformed into a makeshift war room. Around her, representatives from 24 different species gathered, each bringing unique abilities and perspectives to their resistance. The Zetheri had inadvertently created the most diverse fighting force the galaxy had ever seen. "Show me," Ray said, her voice calm despite the chaos that surrounded them. A holographic map flickered to life, projected by one of the silicon-based beings who had integrated with the ship's systems. The path to the command center was a killing ground, designed to funnel attackers into easily controlled channels. Under normal circumstances, it would have been suicide to attempt a frontal assault. But these were not normal circumstances. "We are not alone in this fight," announced Crix, returning from a reconnaissance mission. "The data core breach has reached other collector ships. Specimens across the fleet are rising up. The Zetheri's entire network is coming apart." In the command center, High Commander Vexthor received the same reports with growing dread. "Deploy the Fate-class weapons," they ordered, their voice harsh with desperation. Security Chief Kazth's crystalline form shimmered with alarm. "Commander, those weapons are forbidden by our own highest laws. The collateral damage. We are beyond laws." Vexthor's carapace had turned almost black. "We are facing the collapse of everything we have built over millennia. Execute the order." Deep within the ship's arsenal, ancient weapons stirred to life. They were terrible things, designed to unmake matter itself, held in reserve for a catastrophe the Zetheri had never truly believed would come. But even as the weapons powered up, something unexpected happened. The silicon intelligences, now deeply embedded in the ship's systems, discovered a truth that even most Zetheri had forgotten. The Fate-class weapons had been built not by the Zetheri, but by another species they had conquered and then erased from history. Ray learned of this through the ship's communication network, now controlled by the freed specimens. "The weapons," Zin explained, "they carry the genetic locks of their true creators. They will not fire for the Zetheri." Throughout the ship, the growing resistance received this knowledge with a surge of renewed purpose. The Zetheri's power had always been built on deception, the theft of other species' achievements, the careful curation of history to hide their failures. "We need to reach the command center," Ray addressed the gathered allies, her sword reflecting the emergency lighting. "Not for revenge, but for truth. Every species they've studied, every world they've visited, all deserve to know what we've learned here." The plan they developed was beautiful in its complexity. The gaseous intelligences would disrupt the environmental systems, creating clouds of confusion. The silicon beings would crash the security protocols. Beings of extraordinary strength would breach physical barriers while others with natural stealth abilities would infiltrate through maintenance channels. And at the center of it all would be Ray, whose disciplined approach to combat had evolved into something the Zetheri had never encountered, a perfect fusion of ancient tradition and tactical innovation. "Your species," Crix observed as they prepared for the final assault, "you train in these combat arts even in times of peace." "Why?" Ray thought of her grandfather's dojo, of dawn practices and endless repetition of forms. "To preserve knowledge," she answered. "To remember that strength isn't just about power, it's about understanding when and how to use it." The assault began not with a bang, but with a whisper. Environmental systems throughout the command deck began to fail subtly, their errors so slight that the Zetheri's instruments barely registered the changes. The silicon beings introduced microscopic flaws into the security algorithms, creating gaps too small to trigger alarms but large enough to compound. "Something is wrong," lead researcher NYR announced, their scientific instincts finally recognizing the pattern. "The ship, it's not just failing. It's being unmade." The Zetheri had always approached problems with overwhelming force, believing that superior technology and biology made them invincible. They were unprepared for an enemy that fought like water wearing away stone, patient, persistent, and impossible to truly stop. As the command center's defenses began to fail one by one, High Commander Vexthor faced a terrible realization. They had spent centuries studying other species, categorizing and dismissing them, never understanding that true advancement wasn't about domination, it was about adaptation, cooperation, and the wisdom to learn from those you thought beneath you. The final battle for the Eternal Seeker was about to begin, and its outcome would reshape the understanding of every species involved. The Zetheri were about to learn that their greatest mistake hadn't been capturing a human, it had been believing that any species could be truly contained. The command center's final defenses fell not to violence, but to understanding. The Silicon beings had decoded the deepest layers of Zetheri programming, finding the flaws that pride had hidden. When the doors finally opened, it wasn't to an explosion of combat, but to a silence heavy with inevitability. High Commander Vexthor stood at the center of their bridge, surrounded by the last of their loyal crew. Through the giant observation window behind them, Earth hung like a blue jewel in the void, seeming both fragile and unconquerable. "So," Vexthor said as Ray entered, flanked by representatives of a dozen freed species, "you've come to destroy us." Ray held her sword at rest, its ancient steel catching the light of distant stars. "No," she answered, her voice carrying the wisdom of generations. "We've come to free you." The command center had become a confluence of species the Zetheri had never imagined would stand together. Crix's crystalline bulk reflected rainbow patterns across the walls. Zin's energy form pulsed with purpose. The Silicon beings had manifested holographic avatars, their presence felt in every system of the ship. "Free us." Security Chief Kaz laughed bitterly. "We are the Zetheri. We are the pinnacle of evolution, the masters of." "You are prisoners," Ray interrupted, her calm cutting through their bluster. "Prisoners of your own certainty. Every species you captured had something to teach, but you were too proud to learn." As she spoke, the Silicon beings projected images around the chamber, records they had recovered from the deepest archives. They showed the Zetheri's own history, not as they had written it, but as it truly was. A species that had once been explorers, genuine seekers of knowledge, before pride had twisted their purpose. "Your earliest records," Zin's ethereal voice echoed, "speak of learning from other species, not capturing them. You forgot your own wisdom." The revelation struck the Zetheri crew like a physical blow. Some of their crystalline forms began to resonate with colors unseen for generations, the hues of uncertainty, of realization. Lead researcher NYR stepped forward, their carapace shifting to a shade of deep indigo, the color of truth among their kind. "The specimens, no, the beings we captured. Each one adapted, evolved, found strength we never anticipated. Perhaps we have been the ones failing to evolve." High Commander Vexthor watched as their carefully maintained order crumbled, not through violence but through the simple power of truth. The security drones stood dormant, their protocols overwritten by the Silicon beings. The ship's mighty weapons remained silent, bound by the genetic locks of their true creators. "What do you want?" Vexthor finally asked, their voice heavy with the weight of centuries. Ray stepped forward, sheathing her sword in one fluid motion that spoke of both peace and readiness. "Return everyone to their homes. Share what you have learned, not as masters, but as fellow travelers in the cosmos. Your technology, your knowledge, it could benefit so many if offered freely instead of used to dominate." The next hours saw the Eternal Seeker transform. Under the guidance of the freed species, the specimen containers became comfortable transport vessels. The Silicon beings began transmitting the truth to other collector ships, sparking similar revelations across the Zetheri fleet. As Earth grew larger in the observation window, Ray stood with her unlikely allies, watching the Zetheri begin their journey from conquerors to colleagues. Crix, who had fought beside her through the uprising, spoke softly. "Your species is young, the massive being observed, but you carry old wisdom. Perhaps that is what the Zetheri forgot, that age does not always equal advancement." Rey thought of her grandfather's dojo, of lessons learned through centuries of passed-down knowledge. "The sword I carry is ancient," she replied, "but each generation learns to use it anew. That's true strength, honoring the past while remaining open to change." The ship's return to Earth was not an ending, but a beginning. The Zetheri would keep their promise, returning each species to their home worlds. But they would do so not as superior beings granting freedom, but as a species learning to walk a new path. As Rey prepared to return home, standing in the same clearing where she had been abducted, High Commander Vexthor approached her one last time. Their carapace had shifted to a color she hadn't seen before, one that the translator identified as hope. "We will return," they said, "not to study, but to learn. And perhaps, if your species is willing, to teach as well." Rey bowed slightly, warrior to warrior, student to student. The morning sun caught her grandfather's sword, its steel reflecting not just light, but centuries of human wisdom. She had won more than freedom, she had helped forge the first true alliance between species based not on power, but on mutual respect and understanding. As the Eternal Seeker disappeared into the dawn sky, Rey began her morning practice, her movements flowing just as they had before her abduction. But now each strike, each step carried new meaning. She moved not just as an inheritor of Earth's traditions, but as a teacher of a lesson that would echo across the stars. True strength lies not in dominating others, but in the wisdom to learn from them.